The wagon train had been moving for 6 days when the diary entry stops mid-sentence. "We came upon a valley," the traveler wrote, "so thick with walnut and plum and wild grape that a man could walk a mile and never leave the shade of a fruiting tree." He describes turkeys so numerous they darkened the ground, rivers choked with fish, and orchards stretching farther than his eye could follow. Orchards, he insists, though no one had planted them. Also, he believed, this is not fiction. Accounts like this appear again and again in the journals of European explorers across the Americas, in early colonial surveys, in the notes of botanists who assumed they were witnessing untouched nature at its most generous. They called it wilderness. They were wrong. What they were actually walking through were food forests, vast, deliberately cultivated ecosystems of fruit and nut trees, berry shrubs, medicinal plants, and edible roots, layered together the way a forest naturally grows, but shaped by human hands over centuries. And the mystery at the heart of this story isn't just what these landscapes were. It's how they vanished so completely that entire nations forgot they had ever existed. So what exactly was a food forest? Unlike a modern farm, with single crops stretching in rows to the horizon, a food forest mimicked the structure of wild forest, a canopy of tall nut and fruit trees, an understory of smaller fruiting trees and shrubs, a ground layer of berries and roots. Except every layer was chosen and tended for what it could feed people. Chestnut and pecan groves stretched across the eastern woodlands of North America. In the Amazon basin, researchers have identified forest patches dominated by useful species, Brazil nut, acai, cacao, in concentrations far too high to be accidental, growing in soil enriched by centuries of human activity, adak, fertile earth now known as terra preta. In parts of Mesoamerica, raised garden beds called chinampas produce food alongside orchards of avocado and cacao. Indigenous communities across Australia manage yam fields so extensive that early colonists mistook cultivated grasslands for empty pasture. None of this happened by accident. It happened through generations of careful observation, knowing which trees fed which animals, which plants restored the soil, when to burn undergrowth to clear space for new growth, when to transplant a seedling a mile downriver. This was agriculture. It simply didn't look like the agriculture Europeans expected to see. And that misunderstanding may be the first thread in unraveling what happened next. When explorers stepped into these landscapes, they were trained to recognize farms as fenced fields of a single crop. A forest bursting with variety looked, to their eyes, like nature left alone, Eden, not orchard. Historians studying colonial records have found this assumption repeated constantly, land described as untouched or virgin that indigenous communities have been actively shaping for hundreds, sometimes thousands, of years. The historian William Cronin documented how colonial New England settlers described forests as wild even while native communities were burning undergrowth every year to maintain exactly the open, park-like woodlands early settlers found so remarkable. That single misunderstanding had enormous consequences. If land is wild, it can be claimed as empty. If a forest maintains itself, its keepers become invisible. But mistaken assumptions were only the beginning. What happened to these landscapes after contact is one of the most sobering chapters in this story, and it wasn't any single event, but a chain reaction. Disease arrived first, often decades ahead of European settlers themselves, moving along trade routes and rivers. Epidemics devastated indigenous populations across the Americas so severely that in many regions, the people who had spent centuries tending these food forests were no longer alive to maintain them. Without regular burning, pruning, and harvesting, actively managed groves began reverting to dense, undifferentiated woodland, the very wilderness settlers assumed had always been there. Then came displacement. As colonization expanded, indigenous communities were forcibly removed from ancestral lands through treaties, violence, and government policy, severing the deep, generational knowledge of how those specific forests had been cultivated. Land that had fed thousands sustainably for centuries was cleared for single-crop farming, timber, and later, expanding towns and railroads. And there's a piece of this puzzle many people never learn. Even the landscapes that survived colonization intact were struck by disaster in the following century. The American chestnut, once one of the most important food and timber trees in eastern North America, composing up to a quarter of some forests, was virtually wiped out by an imported blight in the early 20th century, erasing a food source that had sustained both wildlife and human communities for millennia. If you're wondering how something this significant could disappear from mainstream historical memory, you're asking the same question researchers have spent the last several decades trying to answer. What changed to make historians and ecologists start looking again? The answer lies in archaeology and ecology catching up to what indigenous oral histories have preserved all along. Soil scientists studying the Amazon found chemical signatures of human cultivation in soils once assumed to be naturally fertile. Foresters mapping the eastern United States found unnatural concentrations of nut and fruit trees clustered near known historical settlement sites, patterns that don't occur in truly wild forest growth. Ethnobotanists working directly with indigenous communities documented traditional ecological knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge describing exactly which methods had shaped these forests. Piece by piece, evidence assembled from tree rings, soil cores, colonial land surveys, and living oral tradition began telling a story very different from untouched wilderness. It's worth pausing here to imagine what it actually felt like to live inside one of these landscapes. Picture autumn in a managed chestnut forest, the ground carpeted in boughs, families working together to gather nuts that would be stored through winter, smoke rising from controlled burns that kept the underbrush clear and the soil renewed. Picture spring in an Amazonian forest garden, cacao pods ripening beside towering Brazil nut trees, birds, and monkeys drawn by fruit that had been placed there generations earlier by hands long gone. These weren't wild accidents of nature. They were inheritances, built for the people who hadn't been born yet. So what actually happened to the food forests of before 1900? Not one single cause, but a cascade, misunderstanding, disease, displacement, and industrial land conversion, each one compounding the last. Some of these landscapes vanish entirely under farmland and cities. Others survive today as wild forests that ecologists are only now recognizing as a descendant of intentional cultivation. And some knowledge survives not in the trees themselves, but in the communities who never stop remembering how their ancestors shaped the land. What this story ultimately reveals isn't a hidden conspiracy. It's something quieter and, in some ways, more unsettling. How easily complex, sustainable human knowledge can be erased simply by being unrecognized. The forests didn't disappear because someone decided to destroy them. They disappeared because the people who understood them were displaced, and the world that replaced them didn't know what it was looking at. Perhaps the real question this history leaves us with isn't what was lost, but how much of what we call natural today was once someone's carefully tended garden. If a forest that fed thousands for 1,000 years can be forgotten within a few generations, what else might we be walking through right now without ever knowing its true story?